Well, last time we started to talk about uh, what our Muslim neighbours might want to know about us, and we said the first thing we want to know is that we are not a threat, that we are neighbours, that we are friends. But of course, just as we said that we would want to move from just getting to know our Muslim friends in terms of Muslim neighbours, in terms of just normal life, we will have specific things we want to know about what they believe. Well, in the same way, yes, your Muslim neighbour is going to have questions about what you believe. And here are a couple of things. So first of all, there are going to be the big theological questions, aren't there? And they boil down really to who is Jesus? Or what is the gospel? So Muslims will have questions about the Trinity. How on earth does that work? They'll have views about what that means, and they'll have picked up stories and odd ideas, and it will be really. We find that kind of hard to grasp. That's why we sometimes back off and don't want to talk about it, because the Trinity is a really difficult thing to talk about. I've heard things like, Christians believe that God, the Trinity in terms of God the Father, Jesus the Son, and Mary is part of the Trinity. So God has sexual relations with Mary, and that's how Jesus is born, and that's just disturbing and obscene, isn't it? And we would say, yeah, that is disturbing and obscene. And the temptation is to say, well, that's difficult. I don't want to talk about it. So let's try and shift onto something else. But in fact, I want to suggest that the doctrine of the Trinity, rightly understood and rightly described, is fantastic. Because it actually is a great strength. You see, when you think about who God is and how we describe God, if you have a God who is just the one God, can you talk about that God as being love? I don't think you can talk about Allah as being love, and indeed I don't think that Islam would pretend to. So one of the things we want to say to a Muslim is the good news is God is love. And without the Trinity, we can't say that, because it either means that before creation we have a God who is on his own and isolated, with nobody to love, and that effectively suggests two things. One, that if God was love, then that's a kind of inward-looking narcissistic self-love, and that in effect God created us because he needed somebody to love, something to take pleasure in. And so creation comes from a point of weakness on that. And it would mean that once God had somebody to love, that God changed, that this attribute of love became a characteristic that was added to God that he didn't have before. So we as Christians say, no, God is eternal love, because God is love. This is one of those attributes that is essential to his character, and that means that God has always been loving, and God will never stop loving. And that means that in eternity, the Father loves the Son loves the Father and the Son love the Spirit and the Son love the Father. And there's that perfect communion of love. So that creation is not something God has to do, God needs to do because he's dependent on it, but rather we see an overflow, an outpouring of God's love and glory, because it is infinite and overflowing and amazing. And that gets us to start to think about who Jesus is. Not just a prophet, but God himself, fully God and fully man, come to dwell amongst us. So there'll be that theological question. There'll be questions that Muslims have about the texts, about the Bible. Is it reliable? Can I trust it? I've heard that it's been changed. Yes, we believe in the Torah and the Injils, but we don't believe that we've got access to truthful records of them. There's some fascinating views as well, both about those texts being deliberately corrupted, but also the idea that if you translate something, it corrupts that. And so that would be something you'll want to learn about for yourself and know about, is how can I trust the Bible? How can I describe it as God's authoritative word, God's inspired word, without error, without fault, reliable and trustworthy and true? And there'll be lots of other things that Muslims will be wanting to know about what we believe, how it affects our lives. That'll be coming from things that are a very different understanding of what sin is, and so making sense of why it is necessary for Jesus to die, and what the resurrection is truly about. And a lot of Islamic thinking and understanding of the death and resurrection of Jesus actually draws. Remember I talked about this sort of influence of Arianism and Gnosticism on the context where Muhammad was. Well, that seeps its way into the thinking and understanding, both the perception of what Christians believe, but also the answers and the accounts that Islam and the Quran give for what happened there. What we want to be doing is taking people to Jesus, taking Muslims to Jesus, taking them to what Scripture actually says about what happened and why it matters. Why those other accounts and suggestions make no sense, don't work, don't even help Islam out if you like. They're certainly not going to help them out. Here's the third thing. A lot of particularly Muslims that have come from overseas will have the perception that the United Kingdom and other countries like the United States, other Western countries, are meant to be Christian countries. And so there'll be all sorts of questions about morality and how a supposedly Christian country can allow all types of gross immorality. So we're going to need to be ready to talk about what it actually means to be a Christian. That it isn't about being part of a Christian country. And about the difference that Jesus and the gospel makes in our lives to how we live. A friend of mine, when they were studying for their theology degree at Oak Hill, my contemporaries, they had the opportunity to go and interview a Muslim academic for their dissertation. And they had a conversation with this man about modesty and dress. They said, you know what? We agree with you. That as Christians, that we should dress modestly, not with a legalistic kind of way. And there was the surprise. Their concern for that came from a point of love, that it wasn't something imposed in on them, but out of their love and concern for others. Because there's the point of contact, there's something we have to put on. but also the point of difference. This is why we do it, and this is why a legalistic kind of definition of exactly what is where, how much should be covered and that kind of thing doesn't work. So, if we're going to get to know and love our Muslim friends, that means we need to get to know our own faith, our own beliefs better, to know what we believe, to know why we believe it, and to know, be able to talk about the difference that it makes.